The heavy oak door of the mayor's office closed with a sound like a breaking bone. It was a sound of absolute finality, a clean severance from the life Anna had always known. Outside, on the raised boardwalk of the town of Prosperity, the cold was a physical thing, a predator that bit at the exposed skin on her face and wrists. She stood straight, her gaze fixed not on the faces of the townsfolk who watched from behind their curtains, but on the bruised, swollen sky that promised a winter of unparalleled cruelty. Beside her, her mother, Lena, a woman of 70 winters, leaned heavily on her arm. Lena's breath came in small, white puffs, each one a fragile testament to a life that was now unmoored. At Anna's other side, her dog, Fen, a great shepherd with a coat the color of sable and smoke, let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated up through the floorboards. He was watching Mayor Sterling, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a man built of square, unyielding principles. "The debt is called," Sterling's voice had echoed in the stifling office moments before. "Your father's ledger is empty. The town cannot carry you." There was no malice in his tone, only the cold, hard arithmetic of survival on the frontier. Compassion was a currency they no longer had. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, a small sack of dried meat and hardtack that Anna had the presence of mind to grab, and the thin blanket wrapped around her mother's shoulders. They were cast out not into the wilderness, but into the space just beyond the town's definition of itself, a no-man's land of rock-strewn hills and skeletal pines. As they stepped off the boardwalk onto the frozen mud of the main street, the silence of the community was louder than any shout. It was the silence of agreement, of fear, of a people drawing their circle of warmth smaller to outlast the coming dark. Anna felt the weight of their judgment, a pressure as real as the snow-laden clouds pressing down on the mountains. She adjusted her grip on her mother's arm. "We walk, Mama," she said, her own voice sounding foreign and thin in the vast, cold air. Lena nodded, her eyes, clouded with age and confusion, were fixed on Anna's face, a silent question hanging between them. Where could they possibly go? Fen pressed against Anna's leg, a warm, solid presence in a world that had suddenly turned to ice and air. He knew. He felt the shift, the expulsion. His trust was singular and absolute, a small, hot ember against the encroaching frost. They walked away from the faint lights of Prosperity, their three shadows stretching long and distorted behind them, swallowed by the growing dusk. The town did not watch them go. It had already forgotten them. They walked for what felt like hours, the meager warmth of the town fading behind them, replaced by the deep, resonant chill of the open country. The land was unforgiving, a tapestry of granite and iron-hard earth, where only the toughest, most stubborn life could cling. Lena's steps grew shorter, her breathing more ragged. Anna knew they could not last a night in the open. The thought was a cold stone in her gut. Then, a memory surfaced, a fragment of her father's voice from a long-ago autumn walk. He had been a trapper, a man who read the land not for what it was, but for what it could be. He had pointed to a dark cleft in a high, windswept ridge. "Most folks see a hole in the rock," he'd said, his voice raspy with pipe smoke and weather. "But that there, Annie, that's a lung. The earth breathes out of places like that. It breathes out warmth." It was a place the townsfolk ignored, a shallow cave seen as useless, too exposed to the north wind, too small for storage, too damp in the spring thaw. To everyone else, it was a flaw in the landscape. To her father, it was a secret. With renewed purpose, Anna guided her mother toward the ridge. It was a brutal climb, over loose scree and through thorny, clutching brush. Fen ranged ahead, his powerful form a dark shape against the snow-dusted rock, his presence a silent encouragement. Finally, they reached it. The cave was not deep, more of a wide, scooped-out hollow in the granite face, perhaps 20 feet across and 10 feet deep. The air inside was still and held a faint, earthy smell, a scent of deep stone and dormant life. It was colder than the town, but it was a different kind of cold. It was a still cold, free from the searching, soul-stealing fingers of the wind. The opening gaped wide, a perfect funnel for the coming blizzard. Standing there, Anna saw not an open maw, but a frame. A frame waiting to be filled. Her gaze drifted down the slope to the east, where the collapsed skeleton of an old barn stood silhouetted against the failing light. It was part of a claim abandoned decades ago, its wood left to rot. To Mayor Sterling, it was worthless debris. To Mr. Davies, the town carpenter, it was a pile of tinder and splinters. But to Anna, looking at it through her father's eyes, it was a solution. It was the raw material of survival. The next morning, under a sky the color of a lead plate, the work began. The barnwood was old, weathered to a silver gray, and deceptively heavy. Each plank was a struggle. Anna wrapped her hands in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat, but the splinters still found their way into her skin, sharp and vicious. She hauled the boards one by one up the steep incline to the cave, her muscles screaming in protest. The wood was a litany of imperfections, warped, riddled with beetle holes, split at the ends. Yet she chose each piece with care, seeing how a curve might fit against another, how a shorter piece could brace a longer one. Lena, too frail for the heavy lifting, did what she could. She gathered armfuls of dry moss and lichen from the sheltered sides of boulders, her gnarled fingers painstakingly picking out twigs and pebbles. She piled the moss near the cave entrance, a small, green-brown mound of future insulation. Fen acted as a sentinel. He would lie at the crest of the ridge, his head on his paws, watching the path back towards the town. He was their early warning system, but he was also their silent companion, his unwavering presence a bulwark against the crushing loneliness of their task. The first wall began to take shape, a patchwork of grey and brown planks set vertically against the mouth of the cave. Anna used the natural contours of the rock as anchors, wedging the boards tight against the stone. There were no nails, no pegs. She used leverage and friction, overlapping the planks and using shorter, stouter pieces as cross braces on the inside. It was a slow, brutal process of lifting, fitting, rejecting, and lifting again. Her body ached with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. Each evening, they would retreat into the growing enclosure, the day's progress marked by a few more feet of sealed darkness. They ate their meager rations sparingly, huddled together with Fen pressed between them, his body a furnace of living warmth. In the deep quiet of the night, Anna could hear her mother's soft, sleeping breaths and the faint, steady thump of the dog's tail against the stone floor. She would lie awake, feeling the immense, silent pressure of the wilderness around them, and think of her father. He had taught her that a shelter wasn't about fighting the wild, but about understanding its logic. You didn't stop the wind, you redirected it. You didn't defeat the cold, you used it. On the third day, a rider appeared on the low track that ran along the base of the ridge. It was Mr. Davies, the town's carpenter, a man whose reputation was built on square corners and perfect joints. He sat atop his horse, a stout, thick-necked man, and looked up at Anna's strange construction. He didn't dismount. His gaze swept over the mismatched, splintered boards, the clumsy-looking braces, the general chaos of the structure. A slow, pitying smile touched his lips. He cupped a hand to his mouth and shouted, his voice carrying easily in the thin, cold air. "What in God's name are you building there, girl?" Anna paused, a heavy plank balanced on her shoulder, and looked down at him. She said nothing. "That's not a wall, that's a sieve," he yelled, laughing a short, harsh laugh. The first real gust will peel that would off the rock-like bark from a dead tree. "You're sealing your own tomb." His words were meant to be cruel, but they were also, from his perspective, the simple truth. He knew wood. He knew how it behaved. A structure like hers, without proper joinery or fasteners, was an invitation to disaster. It offended his sense of order, his lifetime of practiced skill. "The wood is just the first layer, Mr. Davies," Anna called back down, her voice steady and clear, betraying none of the exhaustion that screamed in her muscles. Her calm defiance seemed to irritate him more than any argument would have. "A first layer of rot," he scoffed. "You and your mother will freeze in there before the blizzard even hits its stride. You'd be better off in a snowdrift." He shook his head, a gesture of final, dismissive judgment. "Don't say I didn't warn you with that." He spurred his horse and rode away, back toward the solid, predictable safety of the town, leaving Anna alone with his pronouncement of her failure hanging in the air. For a moment, doubt, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced her resolve. She looked at the wall. It was ugly. It was crude. Gaps of light showed through the cracks. The wind, even now just a breeze, found its way through a dozen small openings, whispering of its coming strength. She looked back into the cave, at her mother carefully packing mud and moss into a wider gap near the floor. Lena's face was set with a quiet determination, her faith in her daughter absolute. That look was enough. Anna turned back to her work, hefting the plank and setting it into place. Let him think it was a tomb. She was building an ark. She finished the main wall by the end of the 4th day. A small, low opening was left, just big enough to crawl through, with a heavy section of wood to drag over it from the inside. The interior of the cave was now plunged into a deep, perpetual twilight. The air was thick with the smells of damp earth, rotting wood, and the faint, clean scent of moss. But Davies had been right about one thing: it was not airtight. 100 tiny drafts crisscrossed the space, invisible currents of cold that promised misery. As the first flakes of the storm began to drift down from the sky, a soft, almost lazy snowfall, a profound sense of uncertainty settled over Anna. She had staked their lives on a memory, on a piece of her father's strange, backcountry wisdom. Now, huddled in the semi-darkness with the cold seeping through the cracks, she felt a tremor of fear. She watched a single snowflake find its way through a gap and dissolve on the stone floor. Had she built a trap instead of a shelter? Lena, sensing her daughter's anxiety, reached out and placed a frail, trembling hand on her arm. Your father knew the secrets of the cold, she whispered, her voice a reedy reassurance. Trust him, Anna. Trust what he taught you. Anna took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. Her mother was right. She was thinking like a carpenter, like Davies, focused only on the wall itself. Her father had thought like a trapper. He saw systems. The wall of wood was not the shelter. It was merely a tool. Its purpose was not to stop the wind, but to slow it down, to create a zone of still air in front of the cave. Its true function was to catch the snow. As the snowfall thickened, she went outside one last time, dragging a final few planks to pile against the outer wall, creating small buttresses and ledges. She was giving the snow something to cling to. The real barrier, the true insulation, would be the blizzard itself. A drift, 10 feet deep, packed hard by the wind, would have more insulating power than a foot of solid oak. The cave's own geothermal heat, that faint breath of the earth her father had spoken of, would be trapped inside, creating a small pocket of survivable warmth. The porous, ramshackle wall was designed to fail in one way, as a barrier to air, in order to succeed in a much more important way, as a scaffold for a wall of snow. Understanding this, her fear subsided, replaced by a quiet, focused calm. She crawled back inside, dragged the heavy door plank into place, and plunged them into near-total darkness. Now, all they could do was wait. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a rising, insidious hum. The wind picked up, its voice changing from a whisper through the cracks to a low moan, then a rising shriek that seemed to press on the wooden wall with physical force. Outside, the world vanished into a white chaos. Snow, driven horizontally, scoured the landscape. In the town of Prosperity, the people huddled in their sturdy, well-built homes, listening to the blizzard rage. They felt secure behind their thick walls and tightly shuttered windows. But this was no ordinary storm. The wind found weaknesses they never knew existed, forcing snow through window frames and under doors. It tore at shingles and groaned in chimneys. The cold was a living entity, relentlessly seeking entry. Inside the cave, it was terrifyingly loud. The wind howled and screamed against the rock and wood, a sound of pure, elemental fury. The wooden wall groaned and shuddered. Splinters of snow blasted through the remaining cracks, a fine, stinging dust that coated everything. Lena huddled deep in her blankets, her eyes wide in the faint light of their single tallow lamp. Anna sat with her back against the rock, one hand resting on Fenn's warm, solid neck, and listened. She wasn't listening for failure. She was listening for the change. And then, slowly, it came. The shrieking of the wind began to dull, the sound becoming muffled, as if heard from a great distance. The fine spray of snow through the cracks lessened, then stopped altogether. A profound quiet began to settle over their small space, the roar of the storm now a deep, subterranean rumble rather than a direct assault. The snow was doing its work. The drift was rising, burying their shelter, encasing them in a thick, white blanket of insulation. The tomb was becoming a womb. In prosperity, disaster struck the house of Mr. Davies. The wind, finding a purchase on the large, well-built chimney, tore the stonework apart. A cascade of rock and mortar crashed through the roof, leaving a gaping hole open to the blizzard. Snow and wind poured into the house, extinguishing the fire and plunging the rooms into a maelstrom of freezing cold. Within an hour, the house was uninhabitable, the temperature inside plummeting to lethal levels. Davies, his wife, and their 2 small children were trapped. To flee into the storm was certain death. To stay was the same. Panic gave way to a chilling despair. And then, through the howling of the wind, he remembered the foolish girl on the ridge. He remembered his own mocking words, "You're sealing your own tomb." The irony was a bitter pill. Her shelter, which he had condemned as a death trap, was their only hope. Bundling his family in every blanket they had, he forced the back door open against a growing drift and stumbled out into the white hell of the storm. It was a desperate, primal journey, fighting for every step against a wind that stole their breath and a cold that froze the tears on their faces. They were guided by instinct, by the faint memory of the ridge shape against the sky. He screamed Anna's name into the wind, the sound torn from his lips and thrown away, but he kept going, driven by the image of his children's pale, shivering faces. When he finally stumbled against the huge, sloping drift where the cave should be, he almost gave up. There was nothing there. Just a mountain of snow. Then, he saw it, a tiny, faint plume of smoke-like vapor escaping from a small hole near the top of the drift, a breathing hole Anna had cleared with a long stick from the inside. He clawed at the snow, his hands raw and numb, shouting her name until his throat was raw. "Anna! For God's sake, help us!" The sound was faint, a scratching and a muffled shouting from beyond their wall of snow and wood. Anna pressed her ear to the planks. She could just make out a human voice. With immense effort, she and Fenn worked together to shove the door plank aside, and she began to dig her way out through the drift that had piled in their entranceway. When she finally broke through, the force of the wind and snow was staggering. Huddled at the base of the drift was the carpenter and his family, their faces masks of ice and desperation. Davies looked at her, his usual arrogance stripped away, leaving only a raw, pleading humanity. There was no time for words. Anna helped them crawl, one by one, into the cramped, dark, but blessedly still air of the cave. She gave them her own blanket and a piece of the dried meat. They huddled together in the darkness, a small collection of shivering refugees. Later, more came. The mayor's own roof had partially collapsed. 2 other families, their fuel supplies exhausted, had seen the light of Davies' lantern as he fought his way up the ridge and had followed. The cave, built for 3, now held 12. It was crowded and uncomfortable, but it was alive. Anna's foolish shelter, the symbol of her exile, had become the town's sanctuary. They were saved not by rigid walls of hewn timber and square-cut stone, but by a patchwork of rotten wood, a pile of moss, and an understanding of how to yield to the storm, to use its own power as a shield. Huddled in the life-giving dark, listening to the blizzard rage harmlessly above them, they learned a lesson that had nothing to do with carpentry and everything to do with wisdom. They learned that what looks like strength can be brittle, and what looks like weakness can, with the right knowledge, endure anything. True shelter is not always found in what stands against the storm, but sometimes in what has the humility to hide within it.